All right, people, let's start this. I am tired. I have worked like 12 hours today and I am ready to be done. So, this presentation tonight, chapter 20, Big Business and Organized Labor, is purposely short. So, you can thank Solomon Strong for that. He asked to have a couple of presentations broken up into smaller pieces. So, I've done that this time. We will learn more material in class, but this is just a quick overview of the rise of big business and the beginning of organized labor in the United States. So let's get started. After the Civil War, a population boom coupled with rebuilding efforts propelled the nation to the status of the world's greatest industrial power. From a founding of a nation of less than 100 years before, I think this was a pretty marvelous achievement and happened pretty quickly. The origins of this industrial revolution started in Great Britain in the late 18th century. It was marked by the introduction of coal steam engines, the textile machine, and blast furnaces for producing iron. The most important events in this second industrial revolution, which took place in the United States, was the first big business or top industry was railroads. Rail lines linked the West to the economic development capabilities of the East. The first transcontinental railroad was built by the Central Pacific Railroad, working east from Sacramento, California, and the Union Pacific, working west from Omaha, Nebraska. They met at Promontory Point, Utah in 1865. If you ever travel north in Utah, you can go to Promontory Point where they drove what was called the Golden Spike. They drove a spike that was made out of pure gold down into mark the linking of the two railroads. So you can go and visit it when you go up there. I think I went there when I was about 10. Haven't been there since. Railroads were constructed by private companies who raised the necessary funds by selling bonds. Government involvement in all of this. Originally, there were concerns about the constitutionality of the federal government in financing railroads, and it would exclude the federal government from becoming involved in their construction. But beginning in the 1850s, schemes provided federal land to the builders were approved. So they decided that it was constitutional that the government be involved in business. The growth in manufacturing after the Civil War spanned an innovative streak in Americans. A short list of these items were barbed wire, which I talked about in a couple of classes because of the cattle industry and farming and their clashes in the Midwest, refrigerated boxcars, air brakes for trains, and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. Those were all inventions from this time period. You can see a map of railroads of the United States in the West at the time. Railroads made or broke a community. You can look at this map and see how the area of like Flagstaff in Nevada was fairly underdeveloped at this time because no railroad went through it. Most of Wyoming and Idaho and Oregon did not have railroads in them, so those areas and the Dakota Territory did not become as developed with cities as other parts of the country did where the railroad went through. Key early entrepreneurs in our new nation included these men, and they're clockwise from the top left. The guy in the darkest picture is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Then we go to J.D. Rockefeller, actually John Rockefeller, and then we've got J.P. Morgan, and Andrew Carnegie is down here on the bottom left. So we're going to talk about a couple of these guys. John Rockefeller funded the Standard Oil Company in 1870, which refined oil from the Pennsylvania oil fields. Once successful, Rockefeller bought out his competitors and eventually controlled upward of 90% of the nation's oil supply. He recognized his company as a trust, which provided more efficient control over his businesses. He was born in poverty and rose to the very highest of his industry. He was also a very famous philanthropist, which means he donated a lot of money. He gave tons of money away, donating $500 million and more during his 98 years of life. So he was also a philanthropist. Also born into poverty was Andrew Carnegie. He made his name in the steel industry. He was born in Scotland and immigrated to the United States. Using a new process that made steel stronger and at a cheaper rate called the Bessemer conversion process, Carnegie flooded the market with his product and became exceptionally wealthy. He was never a steel expert per se. He was a salesman and an organizer. He was fiercely competitive, and he was obsessed with having things be efficient and innovative, and that's how he made his money. He wasn't a real big like in industry innovator so much as organizing how industry and business worked. J.P. Morgan, on the other hand, had been born into extreme wealth, and he was an investment banker who bought large amounts of stock in corporations and then sold them for a profit. He would buy rival firms that were in trouble, fix them, and resell them. In 1890, he controlled 1/6 of the nation's railroads and is known for consolidating the steel industry. So Carnegie was a steel expert, but the one who consolidated the industry was J.P. Morgan. Richard Sears and Alva Roebuck opened up a mail order company um, in the 1890s by shipping to the customers directly without a store. They eliminated the middleman, and they were able to ship goods and order from a catalog to ship throughout the United States. By 1900, Sears and Roebuck catalog was the second most read book in the United States after the Bible. So I guess you could say that it was the first Amazon Prime. Not quite as fast, however. We're not going to talk about Cornelius Vanderbilt in the presentation, but we are going to talk about him in class, so don't worry about writing anything down about him. One thing that came under scrutiny at this time was the principle of the idea of a monopoly, and we are not talking about the board game. A monopoly is exclusive control of a commodity or service in a specific market, or a control that makes possible the manipulation of prices. So we'll talk about monopolies more in class, but just kind of have a quick overview of what a monopoly is. By modern standards, the working conditions during the Industrial Revolution were often dangerous. The average work week was 59 hours, and the average wage in today's money was $3.50 an hour, as in 2009 dollars. After the Civil War, millions of children took jobs outside the home. By 1880, about a sixth of the children were working a full-time job. Boys were used for deep work in coal mines, and girls worked in textile mills. Children as young as 8 years old were working beside adults 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Now, you think that going to school 4 days a week, 8 to 3:30 is difficult. Imagine having to work in a mill 6 days a week for 12 hours a day. Little or no education was provided, and there was little time for the children to play or be reared by their parents. In 1881, 7 states had anti-child labor laws requiring children to be at least 12, how generous of them, before they were hired. People began to protest against the labor conditions, but the protests were very disorganized at first. Most early protesters were recent immigrants or farmers who were unsure of how to go about making a change. They didn't know how to make a change in a language that they could barely speak. For an example, a group of Irish workers known as the Molly Maguires, who did speak English, used violence to achieve better working conditions in Pennsylvania coal mines. Eventually, 24 of these men were convicted and 10 were hanged for what they did. They used violence, they beat people, and they actually killed a couple people too for vengeance on how the Irish immigrants were treated in the Pennsylvania mines. Here's a picture of what it was like to work on the oil derricks in Pennsylvania. It was filthy. The conditions were awful. The derricks were very close together. The main idea of these original big businesses was to make as much money as quickly as they could, and they didn't really care about safety conditions. Labor protests led to the development of permanent unions. A union is made up of workers and employees who band together to defend the workers against injustice in the business world. Many times these unions promoted violence and the destruction of company materials. In 1866, the National Labor Union, which was known as the NLU, was founded. It was made up of labor and reform groups more interested in political and social reforms than in collective bargaining. This is when they start moving towards political control instead of just focusing only on work conditions. They start having an influence in politics as well. Before disbanding, the NLU secured the repeal of the Contract Labor Act, which encouraged employers to import workers by paying for their passage. So it was almost a rebirth of indentured servitude. It wasn't exactly, but it was close. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was created in 1886 by 25 skilled workers organizations. So it was federation. It was, a group of different organizations led by Samuel Gompers. The AFL allowed only skilled workers as its members to keep out cheaper unskilled labor. Growing slowly, the AFL soon emerged as the leading union in the United States. In 1914, it reached the number of 4 million members, so it was pretty big by 1914. There was also a rise in anarchy and anarchists in the United States during this time. We'll talk about that when we talk about a couple of the presidents that served during this time. Anarchists believed that any form of government was an abusive device controlled by the rich to exploit the poor. Many early labor unions pushed for abolition of government so that they could achieve their goals of no government at all. Here we have a picture of the Knights of Labor. I think this picture is hilarious, how they're welding their tools like they're so beautiful or fancy or whatever. Look at that one with the wrench over his shoulder. I think that's funny. Anyway, led by Uriah Stevens, the Knights of Labor was a secret organization designed to protect its members from retaliation by their employers. They allowed skilled or unskilled laborers to join, and this allowed people of any color, sex, or creed to join their union. In 1886, there were over 700,000 members. The union declined after their failure in a railroad strike of 1877, which we will talk about in class. These labor conditions and unions and all of this led to strikes, too. Not only were the labor unions protesting, but they would actually walk off the job. The financial panic of 1873 and the depression of the 1870s under President Grant hit the West particularly hard. There were a lot of Chinese immigrants there working from the gold rush, and the Chinese were easy scapegoats because they were often willing to work at a lower wage than the general public was. And the public thought that they were believed to be taking American jobs. Sounds sneakingly familiar to what's going on today. At a sandlot in San Francisco, a meeting to show support for the striking railroad workers turned into an attack on Chinese immigrants. We'll talk a little bit about more about that in class. The railroad strike of 1877 lasted for a couple of months. It was the first interstate strike in American history, and it was the result of the financial panic of 1873. It took a few years before the depression from that actually hit the railroad industry. Railroad companies cut wages in order to survive financially for a few years, but striking workers resorted to violence, and order was restored only by federal troops. The railroad strike engulfed hundreds of cities and towns, leaving in its wake over 100 people dead and millions of dollars in property destroyed. As a Pittsburgh newspaper warned, this may be the beginning of a great civil war in this country between labor and capital, and they weren't wrong. There was a rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square in May of 1886 to promote not only an 8-hour workday, but also it spoke of socialism and anarchy. A group of policemen arrived to maintain order. A bomb was thrown into the crowd of policemen and fighting broke out. 7 officers were injured, 4 killed among the rioters, and several others were wounded. The Knights of the Labor Union were blamed for the incident, particularly since one of the speakers in attendance was a member. Soon after, the Knights of Labor faded away and was disbanded. In 1892, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers went on strike at Carnegie's Homestead Works near Pittsburgh. An attempt to break the strike ended in bloodshed when members of the Pinkerton Detective Agency were hired to combat the strikers. Eventually, the militia was sent in to protect the workers not involved in the strike. One of the biggest strikes that paralyzed the United States was the Pullman strike that lasted for a few months in 1894. It paralyzed the economies of 27 states and territories. Members of the American Railway Union, the ARU, working at the Pullman Palace Car Company went on strike. No member of the ARU would handle a Pullman rail car, a sleeper car, which was extremely popular at the time. So there'd be lots of different cars on a train, but they refused to move or switch tracks or switch the order of a car that was produced by Pullman. And this, by mid-July, the railway lines in the Midwest were just a mess, with cars on the tracks that no one could even touch. Eventually, President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops to remove the cars, citing federal authority that needed to deliver the mail, at which time that it was done by train at the time. So that's how they got around that railway strike. And that's it. Aren't you happy? That's not even going to take you very long. Class time will be sent on a collaborative project with the information from this presentation, the readings from documents 1 and 2 in section 4 of your document booklet, and we'll be using the textbook. So come prepared with notes and ready to learn some more interesting stuff about the birth of big business in the United States.